Good afternoon, and welcome to the second Penn-Biden Leaders Dialogue. I'm Bill Berkwite, the director of Perry Worldhouse, Penn's new International Affairs Institute. Today and this afternoon is the culmination of the two-day-long Perry Worldhouse colloquium on the future of the global order. And I can think of no better and more appropriate way to have a capstone for those 2 days of conversations than the Penn-Biden Leaders Dialogue. I want to introduce to you the visionary who has charted Penn's global future, the leader who saw the potential of bringing the academic work of the university together with the policymakers on the front lines of finding solutions to great global challenges, the thinker who appointed Vice President Joe Biden to be the Ben Franklin Presidential Professor of the Practice here at Penn, the 8th President of the University of Pennsylvania, my boss and my friend, Dr. Amy Gutmann.
Wow. It's great to see all of you here. Hi up there, too. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Bill. And let's hear it for Bill's leadership of Perry Worldhouse. He's the best. So, little poll here, a little poll. How many of you here are fans of Lin-Manuel Miranda's smash Broadway musical Hamilton? Yeah? Okay. So I thought so. You all know that there's a show-stopping number that never fails to bring the house down, and it was the number that really totally got me. Well, it is called I Want to Be in the Room Where It Happens, right? So for the next hour or so, that's where you're going to be. We are all going to be in the room where it happens. We are here in Irvine Auditorium today with two eminent global leaders who are in the rooms confronting everything from the global financial crisis, in the room negotiating war and peace in the Middle East, in the room for Brexit, in the room for affordable health care. They have been seated at the table for myriad matters of international statecraft, and we are in for a fascinating discussion. We honor Joe Biden as the 47th Vice President of the United States and Penn's very own Benjamin Franklin Presidential Practice Professor. In his career, as U.S. Senator from the state of Delaware, he was a prominent member and former chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. As a two-term Vice President of the United States, he actively helped shape and guide U.S. foreign policy. He worked and so often befriended foreign leaders the world over. He has probably met, I shouldn't say probably, he has met and had intimate discussions with more foreign leaders than any other living person over his career. One of those leaders is our very special guest for this evening's Penn-Biden Global Leaders Dialogue. The Right Honorable Sir Nick Clegg served as Britain's Deputy Prime Minister in the coalition government from 2010 to 2015. He led the Liberal Democrats from 2007 to 2015, and he was a member of Parliament for 12 years. Before entering British politics, Sir Clegg served as a leading member of the European Parliament on trade and industry affairs. In his years occupying the second highest office in the UK, he helped lead the government's response to the banking crisis of 2008. He oversaw referenda on electoral reform and Scottish independence, and he worked to bring about extensive reforms to the government's education, health, and pension systems. He is an outspoken advocate of civil liberties, of advancing social mobility, and of an international approach to world affairs. Sir Nick Clegg is the author of Politics Between the Extremes, a best-selling reflection on his time in government. These are two incredible leaders. We are in for a treat. Please join me, ladies and gentlemen, in giving a warm Penn welcome to Vice President Joe Biden and the Right Honorable Sir Nick Clegg.
Hello, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.
Sit down, man.
Yeah.
It's good to be back. Thank you all for being here. And we've been doing this with fair regularity. And you can't blame yourself if you're bored because you've heard me before. It's your own fault coming back. It's your own fault coming back. I have with me today a fellow who I have great respect for, and I got a feeling, as the saying goes, Nick, here in the United States, we grew up in the same neighborhood, we've been close friends our whole life. And philosophically, we're not that far off. We saw each other. We're part of a commission that I helped co-found on Russian interference in European elections. And former Secretary General Rasmussen of NATO, Bill Carpenter and I, who teaches here with me at Penn, who was at the Defense Department, and the President allowed me to bring him along to Penn. And I wrote an article on what was happening with Russian interference in sovereignty of other nations. And particularly in Europe, because quite frankly, we thought that there's ample evidence of the interference from everywhere from Italy to France to Moldova, some have met it, some have challenged it, some have succeeded. But, Bill and I thought that this was part of a very, very strategic effort on the part of Mr. Putin to dissemble Europe and NATO. And so Nick is part of that commission. We saw each other in Copenhagen. We had a very good meeting with the other members of the commission. And the poor son of a gun, I saw him, and he does a podcast, which is one of the most popular podcasts in Great Britain. And he asked me to be on the podcast. And
yours was the most popular episode.
Well, as my brother would say, he's a lion, dog-faced pony soldier. That's not true, but it's true. He's very gracious. And we had a great time, and I didn't mean to, but I guess I did. I took advantage of him and asked him if he'd come to Penn to try to make me look better, and he did. And so we're here to answer. I have a few questions for the Deputy Prime Minister, and as well as we're going to take questions. We already have some questions submitted from the audience, from the students, and but let's get started. Nick, one of the things that I told you before, there's two things you got to know about President Gutman. One, she's smarter than you, and two, she never, whatever she starts off wanting, you better just say yes because you're going to end up there. And she came to me early on with a very generous offer to come to Penn, and they named an institute after me up here, and appealing to my ego, and then named me makes me feel ancient, the Ben Franklin Professor.
That's
I'm old,
pretty
but
good.
I'm not that old, guys. I promise you. You know, it's not that bad. But Secretary Blinken, as was the Deputy Secretary of State in our administration, came along, and some other really serious people we brought along with us. And by the way, you students should know, the university's built magnificent space, and I mean this sincerely now, magnificent space at the corner of Pennsylvania Avenue and Constitution, overlooking the Capitol. And there's no excuse for you not to come because only 3 blocks from the train station. But it's magnificent space where we host congressional leaders, we host visiting dignitaries, and we have a student intern program as well. So that's just a little advertisement for you all. But what happened was she asked what we wanted to focus on at the Biden Institute, and it was we thought we should focus on the liberal world order, the post-World War II liberal world order, which we believe created the greatest period of stability in modern European history, and for the United States, created the most significant alliances in history, and generally, although we made mistakes, generally has increased the stability around the world. And my thesis, and I think Nick agrees, although I don't want to put words in his mouth, is that the entirety of American foreign policy rests upon the foundation of a united Europe, a Europe whole, free, and at peace. And because it allows us the flexibility to do what we have the capacity to do in other parts of the world as well. And I was very worried about the demise of that relationship, the transatlantic relationship. And although this is not meant, and I give you my word, I'm not being solicitous, not meant as a debate about this administration, but they have a very different view of our relationship with Europe. And although there's a lot of changes we have to make in that world order to accommodate the changes that have taken place in the last 70 years, we believe very strongly at the Biden state that it's not to throw out the liberal world order. And that the worst thing in the world we can have is this new naked nationalism, America first. I believe making America first in the way we're doing it will make America last. I think it causes us to lose a great deal of influence around the world. And presumptuous for me to say this, and I've said this in front of Nick, I think America really is the most essential nation. Not that we do everything right, but we're the only one with really the capacity to reach around the world and, if we're right, to be a very positive influence. And so one of those, Nick and I have talked a lot about this and other things. And Nick, let me begin the question by asking you, what do you think the greatest current threats to the world order are now?
The greatest threat is world disorder and a collapse in the faith in an order at all. I mean, I think there are lots of reasons which you can speak about with much greater perspective and wisdom than I can about why we've got to the point that we have. Clearly, the collapse of that ideological scaffolding between East and West, communism versus capitalism, which kind of created a sort of rigid discipline almost. That clearly has given way to much greater ideological fluidity, and into that space has rushed nationalisms and separatisms and ethnic and religious identity politics. The rise of the East, in particular China, I mean, those two things were body blows already, in a sense, to the conventional post-war institutional settlement. But then on top of that, we had this collapse in the beating heart of our financial system in 2008, which has left millions of people in this great country and in my country still hurting. And you know, has quite understandably led many people to think that the status quo doesn't serve them at all, and that bankers can get up to all sorts of nonsense and never be held to account, and they pick up the tab and they have to work longer hours for less pay, or the same hours for longer hours for the same pay, or the same hours for less pay. I think all of these things, rise of the East, post-Cold War, ideological fluidity, collapse in our overly sort of financially geared economy. I think all of these things have conspired to create just a wider conflagration of cynicism about the status quo, skepticism about what people say in positions of power, all of which I find totally understandable. The tragedy, and you know this much better than I do, is that we now have a whole cast of populist politicians in Europe, Salvini, Le Pen, Orban, all the rest of it. Here you have I mean, I'm not going to invite you to make disobliging remarks about the current incumbent in the White House, but he appeals to very similar, what I'd loosely call nativist political responses. And that, of course, is very popular, and it feeds this belief that there is no point following multilateral rules, no point constraining the powerful by rules and institutions designed to give a place at the table to the weak. What President Trump said this morning in the United Nations is an absolute apogee of that, which is kind of, I like the world the way it is as long as you guys do what I kind of want, and I'm not going to play by your rules. And I just, it's terribly worrisome because it means that people feel that there is no capacity for the world to act on global issues. And just imagine if the 2008 financial crisis had happened now. I seriously doubt that we would now have the financial or political capacity to act multilaterally in the way that the world did. Imperfectly, perhaps, but nonetheless, it kind of did. It kind of did. And that worries me terribly, because the next time we have a systemic crisis, I really worry that we don't have the capacity to respond systemically.
Well, one of the things you and I have talked about before is that I have never in my career seen Europe writ large as uncertain of its future and its relationships. And what I find is that an awful lot of world leaders and European leaders that are there now, some have changed since I was vice president, but I constantly am importuned by them about what is happening and what is happening in the United States.
Yes.
Have you concluded that you are going to step away from playing a role in trying to move the direction of the world? For example, you mentioned China. I was at the World Economic Forum, and you've been there, and the last two speeches, not last year, the year before, were President Xi and me and then Xi. And it sounds crazy, doesn't it?
Haven't you spent more time with President Xi, I read this somewhere, than almost any?
I think I have. I think I've spent more time privately with Xi Jinping than any world leader. I've spent over 25.5 hours of just private dinners, he and I, and many other fora as well with him. And I was sitting next to Jim Kim, the president of the World Bank. So I spoke, and I talked about this fourth industrial revolution and why it was causing such anxiety around the world, and where there are going to be jobs, and the whole point about being left behind, and charlatans coming along saying, well, the reason you're in trouble is the other, that immigrant, that black guy, that Hispanic, or that and so on, and blaming the other, a tool of charlatans throughout, modern history. And so if you look at China and think about what is happening in China, as when Xi finished his speech, Jim Kim, the head of the World Bank, turned to me and said, "Was that the President of the United States?" He made a speech about the need for the world to cooperate and made the world to come together. Now, he doesn't have the capacity internally to do that, but he's taking the mantle of being a moderating, unifying force in the world. And it's just not, anyway, tell me how you think China is reacting to what I call the vacuum created by the United States, pulling back in this sort of naked nationalism, this Hobbesian notion of, it's either me or you, I win, you lose, I win.
I'm not a great expert or close observer of the Chinese scene, but I think you mentioned earlier what some people call loosely the fourth industrial revolution, the kind of data-driven industrial revolution which we are experiencing at the moment. And the thing I'm struck by over and over and over again, and you will have spoken to far more influential Chinese figures than I have, but those that I speak to, what I'm always struck by is this very, very keen sense of history that lots of smart, sophisticated folk have in China, and particularly in the sort of political elite in China, that China missed the last industrial revolution, but it's going to do everything to win this one. And I think much more in Europe, actually, than in the States, because here it's a much more lively debate, sometimes a little bit coloured by a certain degree of kind of paranoia, but it's a much more lively debate, whereas in Europe, we're being much more sleepy about this, and I think we should never underestimate the collective resolve drawn partly from the way history was experienced by China or is remembered by China, this absolute determination to make sure that history does not repeat itself, that China becomes the preeminent data-driven industrial nation. And I think so much of that explains a lot of behavior.
I think you're absolutely right. China is making, and I meet with a lot of the leaders in Silicon Valley, and they make the argument that China is investing more in artificial intelligence than the United States of America is by a long shot, and they're determined to own the future in artificial intelligence. But this leads to a question.
But it's leaving Europe. I mean, it's a really.
Oh no, I agree.
Mean, it stresses me terribly because you've got this great brewing industrial competition at best, conflict at worst between the United States, particularly Silicon Valley, and China, and Europe is footling around making interesting rules for this new marketplace. So we're leading on the rule making, but we're actually not leading on the products. Yeah. Or we are sometimes in a sort of small scale way, and that really worries me. It's kind of like I find it very frustrating to see that European leaders will invest a huge amount of time working out how to invent rules for products made in different hemispheres. It kind of doesn't feel.
That's an interesting point. I never looked at it that way. We have a question along these lines from a student, Julia Sioka. Is that I pronounce it? Julia, where are you? Are you out there, Julia? Where's Julia? Julia got bored and left already. No. Hey, Julia, how are you? Does Julia have a microphone? Because I want to ask her a question in a minute. Here's her question. Julia is a junior studying political science. Here's her question. How do you think growing nationalist movements, especially the ones that encourage disengagement from the international community, will impact on the ability to address global issues like climate change and the humanitarian crises?
Well, hi, Julia. Well, profoundly. I mean, I don't think I should repeat what both Vice President Biden and myself have just said, which is that we are unwittingly dismantling our capacity to act collectively to collective threats for all of the background reasons that we said. The challenge, though, is, I think, for what I call, and the word liberal is often lost in translation across the Atlantic, but what I call small L liberal folk who believe in multilateralism, believe that collective behavior is better than unilateral action oftentimes. What we need to do, in addition to bemoaning the rise of populist or nativist or protectionist politics, is ask quite searching questions about what we can do to restore people's faith in collective action on the global scale. And my hunch, which is a wholly unsurprising one, is that most of the repair job to people's loss of faith in our multilateral system starts at home. It's not something you can fix through United Nations resolution or a European Union directive or a new institution or a new law or a new convention or a new commission or a new treaty. At the end of the day, I think, most especially, that if people feel that there's been a collapse, as there has been for millions of our fellow citizens, particularly after 2008, a collapse in the basic relationship between how hard you work and the reward you get, it is incredibly difficult to persuade people that they should endorse the great sort of panoply of institutions which are built on their behalf and in their name by their governments. And I can't prove this to you, of course I can't, but you can't disprove it, so I'm going to assert it anyway. I have a strong suspicion that if 2008 had not happened, I don't think my country would have voted for Brexit, and my hunch is I don't think this country would have voted Donald Trump into the White House. And so I think at the end of the day, you know, as Tip O'Neill once famously said, all politics is local, and we need to return to a lot of the local and domestic issues which are the genesis, the sort of petri dish for wider disaffection with the way in which the world works.
Well, let me raise a point off of that. It seems to me, and I know I'm viewed as a cockeyed optimist, but I think I know the history of the journey of this country as well as anyone. And when Americans have put their heads together, and with our British allies as well, there's nothing we've not been able to solve. One of the things that I see happening as I go around the country, and I'm spending a lot of time traversing the nation and the world for that matter, is what I see is a sense that the average American who has no specific foreign policy interest in whether it's Syria or whether it's China or whatever, is an uneasy feeling about America being less secure, less safe, less certain than they did before, Democrats and Republicans. And there's this unease. And Prime Minister Calderon and I have talked about this. He's in the front row here. And it is, and I think there is a growing sense of there's got to be a way to fix this. And one of the things that we're trying to do here at Penn is trying to amend that world order in ways that are able to bring back confidence in the average person and the need for collective action. And for example, you know, globalism has not been an unalloyed benefit to people. It has really left a lot of people behind, but there's ways in which to deal with their dilemmas at home, going to your point, in my view. For example, you know, as things change rapidly in the working place, there's going to be a need from this point on for all of you students to be engaged in continuing education. The fact you can graduate from here next year, this spring, with an advanced degree, a PhD in astrophysics. And if you don't continue to be educated, you're going to be obsolete in 10 years. And so there's means by which we can provide for affordable education, and not just in terms of community college and college, but in degree programs that are run 18, 20 weeks to train people to be able to do things they're not able to do now. For example, there's 100,000 jobs out there in the United States, Nick, that are high-tech manufacturing that we don't have people to fill them, but they relate to things like photovoltaic technology and manufacturing electric shingles or sun panels, et cetera. But it only takes a 16-week program to train an average American to be able to do those jobs. And so when I say continuing education, it is being able to be kept up on what's going on. So do you hear discussion in Europe about how to keep their populations current with the kinds of changes that are taking place in this, you know, Moore's law, artificial intelligence, the whole notion of the way we are, you know, moving along so rapidly?
Yeah, yes. So in the European context, what policymakers will often refer to is that the holy grail is something they call flexicurity. And often, a little bit, it's subject to a bit of caricature, but often the sort of highly competitive Scandinavian economies regarded as having got closest to making flexicurity a reality for their citizens. And the basic idea is that you have a flexible labor market. In other words, hiring and firing is easier than, say, in the more dirigiste economies traditionally associated with France and Mediterranean economies. So you have a flexible labor market, which keeps unemployment low, but you have very, very sophisticated entitlements for people to learn and relearn, train and retrain as they go from one job to another, so that you get the maximum rate of mobility through someone's working life from one job to another, and with very generous state-sponsored, either directly or indirectly state-sponsored capacity to train and retrain and develop qualifications and so on. And that's for a long time always been the kind of holy grail in European policy discussions, that we need to kind of you know, safeguard the dynamism of a flexible labor market, but give people the reassurance that if they lose their job or they run out of road in terms of the qualifications they've got, that immediately something kicks in to give them the ability to develop those new qualifications. And you know, my time in government, for instance, we massively expanded something called apprenticeships. Again, it means different things in different countries, but the basic idea is that, and I shouldn't say this in this location, but the basic idea is that, you know, university education isn't necessarily the best idea for everybody. And in fact, there are plenty of vocational qualifications which are just as important for people's sense of well-being and for society at large. And in the United Kingdom, for sure, we've always had this barely kind of camouflage snobbery that asserts academic. Heaven forfend that academic qualifications are always superior to vocational ones. And so the point you make about lifelong learning or retraining, I think goes hand in glove with the need to give greater equality to vocational and technical.
Well, at the School of Education here, and other places, they're pushing very hard the idea of reconfiguring how we look at high schools. It used to be that you had, Nick, in this country, when I'm 180 years old, but when we were coming up, the public high schools all had things called shop, where you learned how to work with your hands. You learned today, instead of working with a lathe, you may be learning how to code, how to program, etc. Things that are not beyond the capacity of any average intelligent student to be able to learn, and we haven't been doing it, and so a lot of people don't realize. And the other thing we're finding, and you guys have led in this, and Germany in particular, is that when they have internal apprenticeship programs in companies, they save themselves hundreds of millions of dollars and not having to go out and rehire. They train from within, teach people to move from being a lineman at PE&G in California to be the guy who's in the office managing a major chunk of the initiatives that are going on out there. So, but that leads me to, and it really doesn't, but that leads me to an area where you promised not to ask me about Trump, and I should have promised not to ask you about Brexit.
Oh, no,
but how do Brexit negotiations
do I answer this and then you answer questions about Trump? Or?
No, I think I get fired at the university. No, all kidding aside, one of the things since you and I last spoke was that I noticed in the Labour Party, there's even a discussion about the possibility of a referendum. Again, a second referenda. And if the polling data is accurate, and I don't know, something, correct me if I'm wrong, something like 55% of Brits say if they had to do it again, they'd vote to stay. Am I right about that?
There's now a persistent, not huge, but persistent majority in favour of staying, according to the opinion polls. So Cathy Ashton, Baroness Ashton's husband, Peter Kellner, is one of the country's...
Cathy, I didn't see you there. God love you. How are you? You've done a great, great job. You really have. It's good. I apologize. I'm sorry. But how the hell I can recognize Calderon like me from the bald head? That's how I know. You know what I mean? But I apologize.
Anyway, I don't want to interrupt. But anyway, Cathy's Cathy's husband is one of the country's leading pollsters, and he explains in numerous excellent articles that there is now a sustained, not vast, but sustained majority, not least, of course, driven by demographics. I mean, one of the extraordinary things about what's happening in my country, and in my view, one of the greatest tragedy amongst the various tragedies associated with Brexit, is that we're doing something which I defy any historian or student of history in this audience to find another example of the following. We are, as a country, imposing on the next generation a future which not only they don't want, which they explicitly said they don't want in the ballot box. So, over 60% of youngsters, when the referendum took place on the 23rd of June 2016, said they didn't want to leave the European Union. Opinion polls now suggest it's over 80%. And I can't think of any other example anywhere in the developed world that a mature democracy says to people, you, young people who have to live with the future, can't have the future that you have chosen yourself in the ballot box. And that is quite an unprecedented tension in British democracy.
Well, you know, it leads me to, I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you and I generally agree that part of what Putin has been attempting to do is disassemble the EU and NATO. Much rather deal with 28 individual countries, that none of whom have the power by themselves to resist Russian interference, and rather than deal with a unified group of European countries. But without my opinion, let me ask you, how does the dissembling of the economic union in Europe impact, if at all, on the security union in Europe, NATO? What kind of impact, if any, does it have on that issue?
Well, I think in the long run, it has a profound impact, because in the long run, you cannot safeguard your security through military means and alliances and expenditure without having a healthy economy. I mean, a healthy economy is not only good for all of us because it produces jobs and puts money in people's pockets and food on the table, but it is also the quintessential ingredient for a nation's security as well. So, of course, a European continent which is not firing on all cylinders economically is weaker socially, weaker economically, but weaker strategically as well. And as you know, the continent has gone through this terribly turbulent time, as everybody has done in the wake of the financial crisis, but that was accentuated by this north-south tension within the Eurozone, where in effect you had this imbalance, and we still have this imbalance in, this is not so much a British problem because Britain wasn't part of the Eurozone, but in the single currency zone, you've candidly got some countries who never should have been there in the first place, like Greece. They just weren't ready to live by the disciplines of the single currency. But you've got this imbalance that the paymasters of the Eurozone, notably Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, and other sort of surplus countries, are understandably reluctant to put their money on the line to deal with the liabilities and problems of the debtor countries, notably in the south. And so you've had this north-south tension in the Eurozone, where German taxpayers say, we don't want to pay for countries who haven't got their budgets in order in the south of Europe, and southern European governments and voters saying, why are we being told by Brussels and Berlin how to run our own affairs? And simplifying a lot of complex technical stuff, that fundamental tension hasn't yet been fully resolved. So what the Eurozone's been really good at is dealing with one crisis after the next, one crisis summit after the next, one crisis bailout package after the next. But that fundamental tension is still there. And I one of the many things that worries me is that with Britain's departure from the European Union, even though Britain wasn't a member of the Eurozone, Britain was almost always, under all governments of different persuasions, a voice of open trade, dynamic, liberal free market economics, great emphasis on making sure that the single market worked to boost competitivity across the European Union. So my worry is that just as the kind of Eurozone is limping from one crisis to the next, it's having to deal with Brexit, and it's having to deal with all these countries in Central and Eastern Europe, Viktor Orban, the Polish government and so on, who really want to flout the basic rules of the club as well. So it is a continent which is in desperate need of cohesion, but in fact is suffering from very powerful forces pulling the countries apart.
I'm sure you didn't have to deal with any of this, Kathy, when you were running the show, but one of the things that impresses me is it's hard, if I can be very, very parochial, when a husband and wife are having great difficulty on an issue, whether it's as simple as what school your daughter is going to go to, it's awful hard for your wife or husband to turn and say, let's go to bed. When one thing isn't working, other things don't work. And I think what's happened is I observed traveling around Europe and being probably as engaged as a U.S. Senator and as Vice President in European affairs over these years as anybody has, is that it builds resentments. It builds resentments. And that makes it very difficult even when you're talking about cooperating on NATO issues, beyond funding. just beyond whether or not I want to be part of the same club, whether I want to be in on the deal. And so my observation as an outsider looking in, well, we're not outsiders in NATO, but looking in, is that the instability in terms of what is viewed, I think, by many Europeans and maybe even the Brits and the Irish, is that there doesn't seem to be as much of a common purpose that existed before. I mean, and so you see what's happened in Greece, in Italy, in Cyprus, in Turkey, in terms of Russian investment and the willingness to open up and become more susceptible to Russian pressure. So I do worry about NATO, and I worry about when presidents speak. I'll never forget, I was sent over by President Carter because I had a relationship with the German chancellor at the time during the whole issue of tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. And I sat with Helmut Schmidt in his office in a small conference table he had that the German chancellor has. And I was trying to make the case that we were together, et cetera. And he banged his hand on the table and said, "You don't understand, Senator. When America sneezes, Europe catches a cold." And I'll never forget that assertion, that how much what we say. So when we say things like, we're not sure whether or not we would protect the Baltic states unless they pay up, or we're not sure whether or not Moldova, which some of us fought to be able to become part of NATO, that we're not sure we're going to be there for you. Or when we say to Romania, well, I'm not positive what you got to do more. It reminds me as a kid, as a 30-year-old senator at the end of the Cold War, when the United States didn't look like it was there for a European close neighbor to Russia, that they began to make accommodations with the bear. They began to make accommodations with, and it seems to me that's happening again.
Yeah, no, undoubtedly, and particularly, of course, in Central and East. If you listen to Salvini, if you listen to Orban, I mean, it's quite explicit that they look to Moscow, they look to Putin for guidance is too strong a word, perhaps, but they are implacably opposed to a tough European response to Russian interference, and they regard, by the way, the European Parliament elections next summer, ably assisted in the sidelines by characters like Steve Bannon, as their moment to grab back the agenda in Europe. And Viktor Orban is quite explicit about it. He says, I want to see the triumph of what he calls an illiberal democracy. So there's no secret here.
Yeah.
There's no secret here. He regards Brussels, Merkel, Macron as the enemy.
Yeah.
And he thinks that his country should have a strong relationship with Moscow. He thinks that the whole principle of multilateralism in Europe, never mind the rest of the world, is wrong, and it needs to be usurped by the kind of might is right chauvinism which he and a lot of other fellow ideological travelers believe in. And so for the European continent, I mean, I was an MEP, a member of the European Parliament. For those of you who don't know, Europe has a parliament. I was an MEP for 5 years, and frankly, when I was an MEP, I don't think anyone barely noticed what went on there and cared even less. But the European elections next summer will, for the first time, I think, have a pivotal effect on the long-term political tenor of the continent. So it's a very, very important moment for the continent.
Well, going back to your point about it all starts with the domestic politics in each of these countries and a sense of security, certainty, et cetera, that citizens feel. There's a PhD student in chemistry. Benjamin, where are you? A British citizen. I know He's here somewhere. There you go, man. Thank you for the question. Benjamin asked the following. He said, party divides in the U.S. are becoming starker, and in the UK, the coalition government seems like a rare example of a cross-party cooperation in national politics. With increasing polarization throughout Europe and the U.S., is the age of collaborative politics dead?
So, Benjamin, what I discovered is people are always ready to say, why don't you politicians work together? We're so fed up with you arguing. Why don't you get together and, you know, instead of constantly throwing rocks at each other, insults, why don't you get together? And then we got together and everyone said, you're betraying us. How dare you work together? And this is always the problem, is that what I would consider to be a compromise, which in the case of the coalition government that I led with David Cameron for 5 years, is someone else's betrayal. And certainly in the British political culture, which is based on highly adversarial politics, and it's dramatized and orchestrated by the kind of yaboo of Westminster politics, I naively thought that if no one had won the election, and it was obvious that no one had the right to deliver their own manifesto in full, and that everyone had to make compromises, I naively thought that, you know, it was kind of obvious that you had to do give and take. I learned the hard way that for what me is reasonable give and take, as I said, is betrayal in the eyes of people who are kind of, you know, ferocious and partisan about their politics. I suspect in the United Kingdom we're going to have 2 or 3 coalition governments before culturally people get more acquainted with the idea that sometimes working with your opponents, sometimes working across the aisle is not a bad thing, that it sometimes is the right thing for the country as a whole. Other European countries, of course, are much, much more accustomed to coalitions, and it's built into their constitution. It's even built into the physical layout of their parliaments. A lot of them have got horseshoe parliaments, which almost exemplify architecturally the idea that you create a rainbow opinion across the political spectrum. We in Westminster have these seats which are banked up against each other, and they're just made for yelling. That's what Parliament's basically made for. British Parliament's made for yelling. So I think I learned the hard way that the politics of compromise is something which is very difficult to import in political cultures which believe in kind of winner-takes-all tribalism, where, you know, the victorious jump up and down on top of the heads of the defeated until the defeated become victorious and jump on top of the heads of the vanquished, and so on. And I think it's going to happen, because I don't personally believe in the United Kingdom. I just don't believe that the fluidity of British society is going to lead to the traditional knockout results for one party or the other. I mean, we've had a run now of very uncertain or hung parliaments in Britain, election after election after election. The last election was a hung parliament, the one before that wasn't, but the one before that was. So who knows, maybe we need to do it a few times before we get used to it.
You know, Benjamin, I think in the United States we're in a much better shape than people think. If you look at the polling data in the United States, that the vast majority of the American people are sick and tired of the rank, raw partisanship that exists in the United States. And it's not just, it's not an illusion. Prime Minister Calderon and I talked about this just a couple weeks ago at Penn Center down in Washington. And in the United States, this is not your father's Republican Party. This is a different Republican Party. And so what's happened is, with all the uncertainty and the appeal, in my view, to tribalism, this phony populism and this naked nationalism is all designed to make space for as several leading columnists have said, make space for the abuse of power. You know, you had George Will, a leading intellectual conservative Republican, leaving the Republican Party. He didn't leave the Republican Party, it left him. And you have what's happened in the United States, I think. 2 things have happened that have caused this raw partisanship. One was when Barack and I lost the by-election in 2010, what happened was that was a year of reapportionment. And so the reapportionment was, as you see from the cases, and here in Pennsylvania and other places, led to a circumstance where you could commit an unnatural act in the public square and you're not going to get defeated by the opposite party. You get defeated by the right in your party, or in the few cases of Democrats, by the left. And it's moved both parties further left and further right. And the middle has been sort of abandoned because if you look at what's happened, why are our Republican colleagues, who I promise you, know better than what's happening in this administration right now on a whole range of things, why aren't they speaking up? Well, President Trump has solidified that 35% there, and that makes up a significant portion of the registered Republicans, and they know they'll be primaried. If you notice, every major Republican leader who's lost has lost not challenged by the left, going back to Newt Gingrich, but by being challenged on the right, all the way to our present Speaker of the House is leaving because of the movement from the right. And so the whole notion of gerrymandering and the decision, Nick, that we have here in the United States with long campaigns of a Supreme Court ruling that you could have unlimited spending and non-disclosure. One of the reasons Russia was able to have influence in our elections is they have participated in contributing to some of these PACs that no one knows. It can't, because you never have to reveal exactly who has spent the money. And both political parties have succumbed to significant influence by, and I'll give you a concrete example. We have a big fight in the Supreme Court now, but we had a big fight in the Supreme Court earlier when I suggested to the president, because I presided over more Supreme Court hearings than anybody in American history. It shows I'm old, but I also was on the head of the Judiciary Committee for years and years, and as a young man through, and so when we put forward a nominee 10 months out, and a nominee that 34 Republicans, before we announced him, had said very complimentary things about. And all of a sudden, they decide they're not going to, the majority leader decides he's not going to hold a hearing. So I called 12 of my Republican colleagues, because I have great I know it makes me suspect, but I have great relationships with my Republican colleagues. And I said to them, I said, you know, you're making a serious mistake here institutionally. 11 of the 12 agreed with me, but here's what they said, in one form or the other. They said, Joe, if I go ahead and I call for a hearing, the Koch brothers will drop $10 to $12 million into my race. I'll lose. Or if I'm in a purple state, meaning not overwhelmingly Democrat or Republican, I'll end up in a situation where I'm in real trouble. Or if I'm in a hard red state, I'll have a primary, and I'll get beaten from the right. And that doesn't show profiles and courage, but it acknowledges what is the circumstance. And so, but the American people are starting to speak out. If you look at all these primaries, and you look at who's winning in both Republican and who's retiring. And so I think you're going to see a real change in this notion of being able to work together. And the last point I'll make, and this is a unique Biden point, so you can dismiss it completely, but I think I know the Senate and the House as well as anybody who's engaged in public policy. I've been there so long. And one of the things that happens, and think about human nature, if you are in a situation where you're with a group of people and you think you're about to collectively make a decision that's a serious mistake, and you want to speak up to object, but you know even if you speak up, you're not going to win, you tend to remain silent. But if you knew there were 3 other people in that same group who were willing to speak up and you could turn the tide, you'd be inclined to speak up. Republicans don't even trust talking to one another about their discontent with the, I'm not being facetious. Democrats are no better if they're in a similar situation, which you could argue 25 years ago we were. But here's the point. I think you're going to see the Democrats win the House, and I predict they'll win the Senate, but here's the point. It's going to liberate a lot of Republicans who know better. Because now if they vote against a policy they truly don't think is a good policy, they will have the benefit having succeeded. The one thing you don't want, my dad had an expression. My dad was a good man, but to make a point when I'd get in trouble, I'd say, but Dad, I thought, he said, Joey, there's no sense on dying on a small cross. If you're going to die, make it a big one. Well, my Republican colleagues don't want to die in a small cross. And so I think you're going to see a significant change in the politics of the country. And I think a lot of it had to do with the way in which the administration has treated people. And I think the nail that maybe had put in the coffin this time was the way in which the administration responded to John McCain's death. And the way it came across as being so nakedly I never thought I'd ever use the phrase, almost un-American. It was just raw. It's not who we are. So I am hopeful. But then again, I'll conclude by saying that when I was in the White House, I'd always get listed by the press as the White House optimist, like I was the new guy in town. I was there longer than anybody, but I am optimistic about what the position America's in and what's going to happen and the return of a Republican Party. Next question.
By the way, can I just...
You can do anything you want, pal.
No, because my experience of your far greater experience than mine is that your predictions invariably come about. If what you say is true and the Democrats win control of both the House and the Senate, of course it'll change the politics of this country, and not least the behavior of Republicans as you describe. It'll also have a dramatic effect on the politics of Europe, because it'll be the first time that lots of voters, campaigners, activists, politicians think that it'll be the first time they think, oh wow, the pendulum can swing the other way. And I think it would have a really kind of dramatic catalytic effect on the politics of both sides of the Atlantic.
That was and you, as usual, Nick, you said it better than I do. When I said the domestic politics of a country affects its foreign policy and how they're viewed. And I think what is astounding people around the world, and we've talked about this, is they're looking at America in a way today that, that doesn't seem like who these guys are. We are naive. We are, I don't know how many times I've gotten very polite lectures in Europe by very sophisticated people about why you Americans always talk about fairness. What the hell's fairness mean? Well, it's kind of how, and by the way, we've made enormous mistakes. I'm not suggesting we've been right about everything. But the one thing that the rest of the world's kind of looked at us as is we're basically decent, basically honorable. We may be naive, we may not know, we may not be as smart as y'all or whatever, but the bottom line is that they're looking, I think, and a lot of your friends and your colleagues of your caliber throughout Europe have importuned me to ask me about, if you guys are able to come back, we think we can come back because we don't think we're going to be alone anymore. Yeah. Would you elaborate on that a little bit? If that disagree or agree with that?
I totally agree. But can I just, one of the curious things for those of you interested in British politics is that in British politics now, and Britain used to be the most reliably Atlanticist country in Europe, and Britain had, as some of us were talking about in a group earlier this afternoon, Britain retreated, in fact, very rapidly from its kind of imperial reach or overreach, particularly in the wake of the Second World War, and found, despite what Dean Acheson said about the United Kingdom, I think the United Kingdom found a remarkable role for itself as the strongest ally to the United States, but also a leading country in Europe. And now suddenly, Britain is strategically completely adrift because we've lost both. We've lost our place in Europe because we decided to leave, and we've lost our special relationship with the United States because Trump isn't interested in it.
I think that's an interesting. You ought to take note of that. I mean, that's really consequential.
Yeah, but it's very profound for the United Kingdom. But it's been accompanied by something very odd in British politics, which is on the left of British politics. You've now got a leadership of the Labour Party that is probably more viscerally anti-American than any leadership of a mainstream British political party in modern history. And on the right, you have a sort of almost naive belief in the special relationship that somehow, even as we tear up all the relationships with our closest friends in our own neighbourhood, somehow Uncle Sam will sort it all out for us. So you've got naivety and excess romanticism on the right and antagonism towards America on the left. It is hopeless. It's hopeless. And this is all happening. This is all happening at a time when, as I described, Britain is, in my view now, strategically more adrift than it's been at any time since the Second World War. And that's one of the reasons why British politics is both so morbidly fascinating and unpredictable as it has become.
You mentioned early on, and it may be an appropriate question to get, we're getting toward the end, we're both looking at the clock, we're down to 3.5 minutes here. You mentioned the role of young people and the older generation condemning a generation that overwhelmingly wants to be part of Europe to a future without Europe. I just got finished talking to an awful lot of young people, and the registration effort here is today's National Registration Day to vote. And I have an enormous sense of optimism in the 18 to 24-year-old vote and the millennials. They're the most open, they're the most giving, they're the least prejudiced, they're the most volunteering generation and best educated in the history of the United States of America. My generation, for years, the baby boom ruled the roost because we were overwhelmingly the largest portion of the population. Now they are. Tell me about what role you see. And my core optimism, and I did your podcast and you were kidding me about am I optimistic or pessimistic? My optimism in large part is based on the students in this, and I'm not being solicitous, the students here at Penn and across the country. But what is the role of young people to play in your country and in Europe writ large? That's an unfair question. It's so broad, but how do you look at how they respond to this disunity that they're seeing? Well,
I mean, like you, I also, I mean, it's a slightly pompous thing for a 51-year-old to say, but I too basically think that
all you young people think the same way.
But could you believe it? There are people who look young to me, but I do think, as you say, particularly the voters in their late teens, 20s, and so on, have an incredibly positive set of values. You know, I was at university. I was at school in the late 70s, early 80s, university in mid 80s in the United Kingdom, and then it was the height of the Thatcher-Reagan revolution, and all that young. I'm simplifying dramatically here, but the dominant thing amongst young people then was about how to make money. It was an incredibly materialistic, consumer-oriented kind of cultural wave, and maybe, you know, with the hindsight of history, that was not a wholly bad swing of the pendulum from where we've been as a country in the 1970s and so on. But I find that the values of most young folk I meet at discussion groups and, you know, colleges and universities and so on, they're just driven by really positive values. And a lot of those values, by the way, I should stress, led many of them to tear me limb from limb politically because they didn't like what I did and my government did on higher education reform. But the wonderful thing was this was an expression of passionate activism driven by incredibly decent values and ideals. So my biggest fear of all is that those really positive values and ideals topple into passivity, topple into cynicism, topple into, it's all the same, it makes no difference. We all voted in huge numbers to stay in the European Union and yet the older generation is imposing this on us. It doesn't make any difference. And in Britain, for those of you interested in British politics at the moment, Jeremy Corbyn has become the focus for a lot of enthusiasm, particularly for the kind of middle-class, university-based kind of youth activists, which in one sense is wonderful that that has happened. I personally don't think he is the answer to a lot of the country's problems, but at least it shows that people are engaged. And as long as young folk remain engaged and don't give up in asserting their rights and their beliefs and their right to be heard, of course you have to be optimistic. And it's one of the reasons why, again, bringing it back to the parochialism of this all-absorbing Brexit debate in my country, I just intuitively think it's impossible for a democracy to push water up a hill for too long. You really can't frog march a whole generation towards a future they don't want. It just, in the end, that won't work in an open society and in an open democracy. And so as long as young people continue to believe that they can fight for their voice to be heard, yeah, I remain very, very optimistic that things will turn out right.
Well, I'm going to end, we're down to 0 right now. I'm going to end with a question that, as I said, Nick has, I think, one of the most popular podcasts in Great Britain. And what's the name of it?
Anger Management with Nick Clegg.
And
not my anger, you understand.
So the last question Nick asked me on the podcast was, he said, this is a variation of the question you asked me. You said, are you an optimistic person? And I laid out why I was so optimistic about the future. And so I'm going to end with a question to you. Are you an optimistic person?
You bet, but I do worry that it's, I mean, I think...
It may take time.
Well, we've got to strap our belts in. It's going to be a pretty volatile time. We're going through a period of transition. Periods of transition are always volatile periods of time, but generally they also produce the best in people as well as bringing out the worst in people. I would argue, leave a thought with you all. And I'm sort of, there's a few people now beginning to agree with me, a few intellectuals, that if you take a look at every time there's been, in the last 150 years, a significant technological change in society that's taken place, whether you call it a new industrial revolution, whether it's the Luddites going through the Midlands of England, smashing the machinery because the culture was being changed or whatever. Look at all those places. That's the place in which the charlatans have stepped in, used to a very, very significant degree this phony populism and this naked nationalism, which is very enticing when you feel like you're being left out. And I think that explains an awful lot of what has happened here. But I also think that this country, my country, and I think yours too, but I can't speak to your country, is too big, too strong, too solid. And we do not, Nick, the way countries have organized and the way people have organized for the last 100,000 years has been either on religion, tribe, or ideas. And keep in mind, everybody here in the United States, America is an idea. We're an idea. And the reason for our strength is because we have been able to, and I said this to a brilliant guy who passed away in Singapore, whose son is now the president, who is a great commentator on the future of the future of Russia, India, China, and the United States. And I looked at him and I said, Mr. President, I said, tell me, he wanted to meet with me. I was in Mumbai and I stopped to see him in Singapore. And he wanted to meet with me because I had spent so much time with Xi Jinping and he had consolidated power so quickly, Xi Jinping did. And I looked at him and he said to me, I said to him, what's China doing now, Mr. President? And he said something fascinating to me. This is when that aircraft, remember, went down the Indian Ocean and we couldn't find the black box. He said to me, Nick, he said, they're in America looking for the buried black box. And I looked at him like, what the devil is he talking about? He was 92 years old, a brilliant guy. I looked at him, I said, Mr. President, I don't understand what you mean. He said, they're looking for that box that contains the secret
and this sounds chauvinistic and I apologize, but he said it. He said, allows America to be the only country in history to constantly be able to remake itself. Yeah. And I said, Mr. President, I've been around long enough now, I'm going to venture an answer to you. I think it's two things. One, in America, we do not worship at the shrine of orthodoxy. No student, no matter where they go to school, no matter how bad the school, ever gets criticized for challenging orthodoxy. That's why we are able to break new things to make new things, old things to make new things. And I said, there's a second reason. He just nodded when I said that. And I said, the second thing is, Mr. President, we have had massive waves of immigration met by xenophobia for periods that would last from 2 years to 10, but always overcome. And he looked at me and he said, why is that so important? I said, we've been able to cherry pick the best of every culture in the world. And I mean this sincerely. Think about this. I'm not trying to make you all liberal supporters of immigration, but think about this. Whatever your family background is, when that first relative got on a ship, and most of them are like my relatives coming out of the potato famine, coffin ships, it took an enormous sense of optimism. It took an enormous sense of determination. It took an enormous sense of purpose to do it. Right now, a family's down in Guadalajara, Mexico, and they're at a hand-hewn kitchen table having their dinner, and the father says, I got a great idea. Let's sell everything we have. Let's give it to a coyote. He'll smuggle us across the border into a country that doesn't want us, in the middle of a desert where we don't speak the language. Won't that be fun? No, think about it. Think about whether it's from Africa or South America or Europe or Russia or China. Think of what we've been able to get here. America is an idea, and the only thing that can define us, Nick, we can't be defined by religion, by culture, by background. The only thing you can define America, try to define an American for me today, what that is, other than basically agreeing to a prescription, and they wouldn't say it the exact way, contained in the Constitution. We hold these truths self-evident. That sounds corny. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator. When you press Americans hard, no matter how little education they have, the one thing that unites them is this notion of how we're going to govern ourselves, how we treat each other. So all America has to do is stand up, pick their head up, realize who the hell we are, and understand there's never been a single thing we set our mind to we haven't been able to do. Okay? And that goes for Britain, too.
So wonderful to hear you talk about that. It really is.
I believe it.
Please join me in thanking Professor Biden, the 47th Vice President of the United States, and Nicholas Clegg, the former Deputy Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. We have learned so much from both of you today. What a fabulous conversation. Thank you all very much, and have a good afternoon.